Hello, everyone, and welcome to ACS webinars, connecting you with the best and brightest minds in chemistry, live from Washington, D.C. I'm Russell Silber, and I am pleased to be your host for today's broadcast, which is being co-produced with ACS on campus. Submitting an article for publishing is no walk in the park. We will be hearing today from Mary Beth Mulcahy, the Editor-in-Chief of ACS Chemical Health and Safety. Mary Beth is going to share 10 essential tips to ensure you're preparing the best manuscript possible for submission. We would love to get you involved in the discussion. You can share your thoughts and questions in the questions panel, and you can also join the discussion on Twitter by including @AmerChemSociety in your tweet. The slides for today's webinar can be accessed right now by clicking the link that you see in the GoToWebinar control panel. An invitation email to view the unedited recording from today's presentation will be sent to all registrants for a 24-hour period, after which it will be removed, edited, and become an ACS member benefit on our website. Our moderator for today is Kaylee Miller, who is an assistant managing editor in the publications division at the American Chemical Society, where she is responsible for the day-to-day management of organic process research and development and ACS chemical health and safety. But before I turn things over to Kaylee, we'd like to learn a little more about everyone tuning in today. So for our first poll, we'd like to know, have you ever published your research? And please select all that apply in the window that is about to pop up here. Yes, as a corresponding author in an ACS journal. Yes, as a co-author in an ACS journal. I have published as a corresponding author in another journal. I have published as a co-author in another journal, or I have not published yet. And while you're putting in your answers, I'd like to remind everybody that to please submit your questions for Mary Beth early and often for the live Q&A at the end of today's broadcast. And it looks like the responses are coming in, so I will close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so it looks like the 48% said they have published as a co-author in another journal, and then 29% said I have not published yet. 23% said I have published as corresponding author in another journal. 33% said yes as a co-author in an ACS journal, and then yes as a corresponding author in an ACS journal was 17%. So thank you very much for sharing, and I will now turn the time over to Kaylee to get us started for today.
Thank you. As Russell mentioned, preparing your manuscript for publication is no walk in the park. However, there are general guidelines that can be followed to share your science with confidence. So today, ACS Chemical Health and Safety Editor-in-Chief, Mary Beth Mulcahy, will be sharing 10 essential tips to ensure that you're preparing the best manuscript possible for submission. Dr. Mulcahy is a principal member of the technical staff in the Global Chemical and Biological Security Group at Sandia National Laboratories. She joined Sandia after 9 years as an investigator with the U.S. Chemical Safety Board, which is an independent federal agency that determines root causes of major chemical accidents in the U.S. So with that, Mary Beth, please take it away with your presentation.
All right. Thanks so much, Kaylee and Russell. So we have a wide background today of people listening in and experiences in publishing. And what I'll try to do is just give you some tips of what I've learned over the past, I guess, 9-10 months now being an editor for a new ACS journal. So the first tip that we have here is, create a useful outline. If you've never published before, I think sitting down at a computer with a blank screen can be a difficult task. What are those first words you put down? One way to start to formulate your thoughts and ideas is to gather your data and ask your questions about why, what, how, what are you trying to communicate? How are you going to communicate it? Is it going to be in graphs? Is it going to be in images? And helping your audience understand why your research is valuable to the larger scientific audience. We have a note here about organizing your data by importance, not chronologically. I can remember from my own graduate school days, some of my most important research was not the first research I did, it was actually those final experiments. And so those were the ones that led coming into the paper. So you're going to want to consider as you start to decide what to share with your audience, not just the order, but even what is important. Because not every experiment you did, actually, it might have helped you as a scientist understand what you were doing, but may not be useful to the larger scientific community. And so you're going to want to think about those aspects. Very importantly, and you're going to want to think about your figures. I think figures communicate so much, whether you're looking at spectra or, again, images. I see a lot of comments coming back from peer reviewers, particularly about figures. And we'll talk a little bit more about those later on. And then, having someone review your outline. It is, to give feedback before you put in your heart and soul into your paper. It is difficult to write, a long paper and then get the feedback from peers in your own group or your professors that they think half of what's presented isn't useful because you've now spent all this time and invested in it. So getting some help before you start writing can be very useful and save time and heartache later on down the road. Now, this one's important about choosing your journal carefully. Right now, there are over 33,000 peer-reviewed English language journals. And so that's quite a few journals that you could choose from. Just from ACS publications alone, we have more than 60 journals that scientists can choose to publish in. And the questions you want to ask yourself is, what field and subfield are you trying to reach? So, you want to consider, are you looking for a very wide audience that you think your results would be useful to a wide range of scientists? You might consider the Journal of American Chemical Society, or maybe you have something that's more focused to a more specific subset of scientists. So the Journal of Organic Chemistry or ACS Nano, or, you look at the case of the journal that I edit, ACS Chemical Health and Safety. That one has a wider audience. There's a lot of learnings that can happen between multiple fields, whether you're a physical chemist or organic chemist. But I will tell you, I get a lot of papers that they're outside of it. And so sometimes as an editor, I take the time to look up journals I think might be useful. And sometimes I just simply have to say to people, this is outside the scope. Please go look at, what we've said the scope of the journal is. And I strongly recommend you do that before you submit. It'll save time from publication on your side, but it also it helps the editors out as well, so they can focus their time on the articles that are most appropriate for their journals. So for instance, the scope of my journal reads, the ACS Chemical Health and Safety is a global platform for ensuring that all members of the chemical enterprise receive access to new research, safety information, regulatory updates, effective chemical hygiene practices, and hazard assessment tools. So that gives you an idea, but I will say there are times that I have authors correspond and send emails and ask, do you think this topic is appropriate for your journal? And we do, at our journal, we do talk back and forth with potential authors, because there are times that I think topics are on the edge of what maybe I was considering. And so sometimes it's helpful to have that initial conversation. Not all journal editors may have that time, but for our journal now, since we're new, we do find ourselves corresponding with people, a fair amount to try and help them decide, or what's the particular aspect of what they're submitting and how does it fit within that journal. This is important to consider because you don't just want to publish an article, you want it to have impact. Recently I saw a paper that was submitted, and it was really about food safety. And I rejected the paper in part because as I said to the authors, I don't think you're going to reach your peer audience. So I didn't know that other people who do research in food safety would find their articles in the Chemical Health and Safety Journal. So again, there's a benefit in ensuring you're publishing in the right place so that other scientists see your work and will cite your work as you move forward. So I'm going to turn this over to Russell. We're going to do another poll question here.
Thank you, Mary Beth. So for our second poll question, we would like to know, for those of you that would like to get your research published, what stage are you currently in? And you can choose your response on the screen open now. Your options are: I am ready to submit now, I am searching for a journal, I am writing a manuscript, I am doing research, or not applicable. And while you're putting in your answers, once again, I will remind everyone to submit your questions for Mary Beth in the questions panel for the Q&A happening at the end of today's broadcast. And I'll leave the poll open for a few more moments. Okay, it looks like we are ramping up to about half of the audience, so I'll close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so it looks like the most popular option was I am currently writing a manuscript at 51%. And then behind that, I am doing research was 28%. And then the rest, I am ready to submit now, I am searching for a journal, and not applicable were in the single digits. So I'll turn things back over to you, Mary Beth.
Okay. And just confirm with me that my screen is showing.
It is showing, yeah. There you go.
So a lot of you are in the process of writing up. I would say, even as you start writing now, one thing you can do to help yourself save time and just reworking later on is try to identify the journal or journals you think would be most appropriate for your research. Then go to that journal's website and look up the author guidelines that are provided. By doing that, you're just going to help clear a hurdle that might otherwise delay submission. If we get a submission in that doesn't even come close to meeting the author guidelines, I don't even see it. It gets filtered and it immediately goes back to the authors through somebody, one of our other people that check those guidelines. So that just delays the potential for your manuscript to be published. So look at those author guidelines. If you have a clarifying question, certainly ask, but not every journal is the same. And the other thing is, look at the reference formatting for your citations. I see a lot of people having to redo reference formatting, redoing graphics, and I think you can just save yourself time and give the best impression on the first time an editor sees your manuscript. We get quite a few submissions, and if I start to read a manuscript that I can tell is not following the guidelines, or I think did not give its best foot forward, I see a misspelling right away, or I see something that's difficult to read in a figure, sometimes I just decide to, reject it and give the author an opportunity to resubmit, but that has already left an impression in my mind. So consider that to put your best foot forward, and certainly following those guidelines will help with that. In that same vein, when you're writing a paper, think about the story you're trying to tell. Your paper should have a main theme, say punchline here. It should just be clear what your objective is while you're writing that paper. Definitely provide context to prior literature. This is helpful for new scientists. You might help inspire scientists who weren't considering a new application, but it's also helpful to see how recent your citations can be. It gives the editor an idea of, is this timely research? Or are these citations 10 years old? And so it helps give some insight into the current, how current your research is. And so while you're doing that, part of what you need to do is explain the importance of your problem, particularly if you're taking off from an original type of, or one type of research and branching out into a new area. Sometimes you need to provide that roadmap for your readers to be able to understand, why are you making this change? And this next line about sharing your experimental details that allow a reasonably educated person in your field to reperform the experiments and reproduce the results is very important. I will tell you, peer reviewers are very perceptive. I get many a comment back when peer reviewers don't, or they feel that the information being provided isn't sufficient, or they have doubts about the research being provided. Or the results being provided. And sometimes it's just because a detail was missing. So it gave the wrong impression of how the experiment was being conducted. So make sure you look at how you're talking about your experimental process. That doesn't mean you need to have every single step, and it is appropriate to reference published methodologies. But if there is something different you're doing in your research, you need to give enough detail that somebody else, could try and reproduce it. In fact, that would be a compliment if somebody looks at your research, is able to cite your paper as inspiration for doing some new research. You want to analyze your data accurately and objectively. The objective part is important. Again, peer reviewers can tell when it's not objective, and they certainly comment on that, and you'll get that in the peer reviews you receive back. Provide strong conclusions, but really important, be realistic. I do see a lot of statements about this being the only way, or this is the best way. And I find that those I would call them sometimes, exaggerated statements, they certainly get picked up on again in the peer review. Scientists and your peers who are reading your papers, they need enough information to make the judgment themselves. And so consider that as you're working, and when someone starts to over promote their results, I think it tends to cast some doubt potentially on what's being presented. But a well-presented argument and well-presented research, it leads the readers to the natural conclusion that you want them to arrive at, if you've done a good job organizing it for everyone. And this means this is true even not only in your results, but what do you think your potential future directions of your work are? I don't think every paper needs that, here's what we could do in the future. Many of them do have it. If it's reasonable and then it can be inspirational, I think that that's useful. But if you can't think of something that naturally flows from what you're writing, I would suggest not creating something just to have that fit there. So some common language pitfalls, and I see these statements on the left often in papers. It has long been known, in my experience, in many cases, in a series of cases, it is believed, and it is generally believed that. And you can see on the right side what some of that translation, what does a reader think or an editor think when they see that? It has long been known. We start to wonder, why aren't the references being cited? In many cases, again, is there citations that can support that, or is this just once, a couple of times that it's been cited or been cited or published? So you want to consider that. Even this, it is generally believed that, that's the kind of sentence that you don't actually know it, but if you just cited good research that said, in recent past, multiple researchers have discovered that, and you have the citations there, what you've done is you didn't have to re-describe all the work, but you provided your audience the ability to go look those references up themselves and come to the same conclusion that you want them to. So consider those phrases. This is one of the best slides to download after this presentation. So we have here the anatomy of a manuscript. So the basic parts that you would consider seeing. So clearly you're going to have a title and you're going to have an abstract. I would say that abstract is very important to editors. I always read the abstracts. I often myself read the title, the abstract, and then the conclusion. And then I come back to the beginning of the paper because I like to know what I'm reading for. I'm sure other people have different approaches, but that's my personal approach. So I always want a good abstract and a good conclusion. So in most manuscripts, you're going to have an introduction. You'll have graphics, your experimental section. You'll just have a section for discussing your results and a discussion about them, and a conclusion. And then finally, you'll have your references. One note of caution, if you excessively cite yourself, so if all your references are your own previous work, again, your peers are going to note that in their reviews. I see that happen often. So there's no problem with citing yourself, but make sure it's balanced. Cite the other people that have inspired your work or their work that you've read or are aware of. It helps give the impression that you are a balanced person and you're looking at multiple sides of the problem. So this tip is draw graphics with care. I currently recently have seen several comments or several papers that are turning in graphics that are not clear. Either their labeling on their graphs is imprecise or too small to read, or the lines are not, it's not easy to get the information from the graphic. So you want to spend some time on these, because these are what can help make your argument and help a peer reviewer positively look at your research. Nowadays, for instance, our journal is published online, so where appropriate, use color. Make it easier for your readers to follow what it is you are saying. Graphics should be original and unpublished work that are created by you, the author. There are times that reproduced graphics are cited and published, and make sure you follow the author guidelines for how to do that and how to make sure that you're doing that correctly. Otherwise, it can delay the publication of a manuscript. Next tip is attract readers with a strong title. So you do want to craft a compelling title. From my own experience, I open up journals and I read the table of contents, and it's based on the titles is how I decide sometimes which articles I'm going to read. And so assume that your audience will be doing the same thing. Avoid buzzwords and hard to justify claims. Like, this is the first time something has been done, or this is the only example of, I suppose if it's really true, but you could put it in there. But again, your peers are going to look very critically at those kinds of comments, and they'll note them. In general, avoid asking a question in the title. So here's a more detailed example of that. So here's a long title, the synthesis, electrochemistry, spectroscopic characterization, and X-ray crystal structure of a novel complex that attacks DNA and cures cancer. So what this title tried to do is name every single type of analytical method that was being used to conduct the research. And it's a long, cumbersome title. So there is a shorter version of the title just below, and it talks about this compound is a complex that cleaves DNA at the nanomolar concentrations. So, for somebody who's in this field, they don't necessarily need to know about what the specific analytical methods are. What they want to know is the point of the research, and it's that cleaving the DNA. So that gives you a short, strong title that's easier for someone to quickly read and become interested in your research. So nowadays online, table of content graphics can really draw a reader in and increase the number of people who click on your research article to start to read it. So consider what graphic you would like to accompany your online manuscript. In particular, I'm thinking about this for my own journal, and you can see here's a couple of images. And so what these images that show up on the table of contents screen, they should resonate with the title and help provide some insight into what a reader might expect. They provide, immediately a sense of what's going to be learned, and they should be clear and concise. And again, you want them to be compelling. You want to draw your readers in. So consider that table of contents graphic as you're writing your manuscript. So revise, edit, and rework. You really do want a lot of eyes in your paper. I mentioned earlier wanting to put your best foot forward. I certainly believe I've seen papers that were not peer reviewed before they were submitted to the journal. The journal should not be your first review of your paper. It should be your colleagues, your friends, your professors. You want other people to critique it, because again, if you don't make it through, or if you get if peer reviews suggest a reject or a major edit, you've just decreased your potential chances of being published in the journal that you submitted to. So the less number of mistakes or misspellings or unclear statements that you can catch before you submit to a journal, the bigger the opportunity is, or you've increased your odds of being published. So take the time to have peers review your paper, redo the manuscript, and do that so that, again, you're not turning in a first draft to a journal, you're really turning in what you think is your best draft. If you need help with that, ACS does have several services to help authors. both with editing, translation, formatting, and figure services. So, look at this link and take advantage of this. In my particular journal, we get a lot of international submissions, and if the journal paper comes in and there are some issues, which is natural with some of the English, we oftentimes will not let the paper go through review until we've directed authors to this type of service anyways. So go ahead and take those steps on your own if you need to. And they're nice resources there to help you. Another topic to consider is, what about supplementary information? So not everything that you've done or the data all fits into the context of a publication, but particularly with online publishing, you can add supplementary files to your paper that readers can choose to look at and download. We have them in our journal. I find them very helpful, and it helps provide more detail and insight for somebody who, again, is inspired by your work and wants to take a closer look at what you do. I also find peer reviewers looking at those supplemental information. And so consider, even though it's supplemental and not necessarily your main part of your manuscript, look for those errors. Certainly errors are published in these, but you want, that has the potential to harm you later on. You don't want to have people questioning your supplemental information when in fact it's not a reflection of poor research, it's just a reflection of a typo. So take the time again to review those and ensure their accuracy before publishing them. The next tip is to write a strong cover letter. And I think I would argue that there are two cover letters. There's the first one that gets submitted the first time you submit your paper. I would suggest using the correct journal name. I definitely see people that I believe probably submitted to another journal and they forgot to change the journal name in the cover letter as they submit to me. Not that I mind that people are looking at different journals to submit to, but it doesn't give a good impression when you don't have the correct name of the editor or the journal on your cover letter that you're submitting. In the cover letter, you can highlight the relevance and importance of your work, and you can explain why the work is appropriate for the journal's readership. I do find, I look less at the highlighting the relevance and importance of your work, because my approach is to read again the abstract, usually the intro and the conclusion. But I do find sometimes explaining if it's appropriate for the journal's readership is important, because there are times that I receive papers and I don't immediately see the connection, but I'm not an expert in all the fields that are submitting to the journal. So I do think it's possible that having that little bit of explanation, because our editors, I have a very, a specialty, and sometimes I just don't see that connection, and it's related to safety, but I need that help from the author. I will tell you, to me, the most important cover letter is the one that comes in after you get back your peer reviews. So once you submit your paper, most of the time, we send those papers out for peer review, and most of the time you'll get an opportunity to respond and make changes and edits based on what the peer reviewers have said. I think this is an incredible opportunity for everyone to look at what your peers are saying, to make improvements, and I look very closely at that cover letter. I want to see, first of all, respectful responses, and if an author disagrees with a peer reviewer, I take that into account very strongly when I'm looking at a paper. You may not agree with a peer reviewer, and that second cover letter, when you turn in your revision, can become very important in conveying that information and helping an editor to make a decision to accept your paper without making a change that someone offered. So take the time on those letters. Finally, you want to submit your paper into the ACS publications. We have ACS Paragon Plus. There are checklists and other tools that will help you ensure that the submission is complete. Again, if you don't submit completely and follow all the expectations, the paper will get sent back to you and just simply delay the process for you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kaylee, and she's going to help with field some questions that I believe the audience may have.
And actually, before Kaylee begins the live Q&A, I'd just like to remind everyone that ACS Webinars has increased its online content to one free broadcast every weekday. Tomorrow, we encourage everyone to join ACS leadership for a discussion on how the COVID-19 pandemic is market.
Articles, yeah.
So it's so funny. I find review articles very valuable, and
to share the current challenges you are experiencing.
So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kaylee, and she's going to help with some field some questions that I believe the audience may have.
And actually, before I'd just like to remind everyone for your labs up and running safe market. And then next week on Wednesday, we market begin the live Q&A.
Thank you. All right, so I have had a lot of questions about reviews, probably because a lot of people are sitting at home right now, and I might sort of group a couple together. Mary Beth, for you. Melissa had asked how much information should I, consult in order to write a review manuscript? Do you have suggestions for organizing? Literature review framework, how do I get started? Any tips, just general advice about review articles? Yeah.
So it's so funny. I find review articles very valuable, and I still remember the one I kept my entire, 5 years in graduate school because it was so helpful. A good review article can have a very large impact on your peers doing similar research. I personally have not read a review article, I have not written one, but the ones that I liked were the ones that told the whole story, that they had the earliest publications so we could understand what some of those essential, key articles were that were written, but then followed up on how the research progressed over time, even if different conclusions were later on deduced or determined. And so at the time of the publication, looking at does that review cover that whole time frame up until the most recent at the time of publication? I do think don't underestimate talking to other chemists that are in your field or your professors or people who've been at this for a long time. What happens is as you progress in your career in particular fields, you start to know who the key authors are. And just by asking other scientists who are the key authors or what key papers did you see or did you find yourself reading will help guide you towards those papers. Also consider when you look at papers that have been published, if somebody's recommended a paper, when you do your searches, see who cited that paper to see where that paper is going and note the number of times a paper is being cited. And that helps give you an idea, is this a paper that's having a large impact that a lot of people are referring to? And that'll just help you gain some confidence that you're finding those key articles that you would want to include in a review paper.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Another thing I'm seeing a lot of is questions about plagiarism, what kind of data to include, appeals if people think there's an unfair review. And I'm actually just going to quickly answer this and emphasize the author guidelines for each journal that Mary Beth had mentioned in the presentation. So each journal has their own author guidelines, which have sections on all of these questions. And in order to find them, you can just Google it and go to the homepage of each journal and navigate to the About the Authors section. So another group would be picking the right journal and manuscript type for you, Mary Beth. So there have been some questions. Enrique asked, could you please give some advice about choosing the right article format? For example, letters, communications, full articles.
Well, if I'm being completely honest, sometimes we have to ask that questions ourselves because I'll give you an example. We had a paper submitted, and it was submitted as a research article, but it was a proceedings of a conference that had occurred. And if it's a research article, I'm certainly going to send it out for peer review. But when it's the proceedings of a research of a conference that occurred, that's really a report out. And so we actually worked with the authors and we decided to change the manuscript type. We turned it into a commentary because to me, if it's a research article, it implies peer review has occurred. In our journal, particularly, we have case studies, we have research work, we have reviews, we have methodologies, we have so many different types, and we're new, so we're still ourselves sometimes having those conversations. But I do think, I know for ourselves, we've tried to refine our author guidelines. So I definitely recommend you go back to the author guidelines and see what each journal is asking for, because even though ACS has more than 60 journals, they're not all the same. They each have their own personality and requirements. So I'm just going to strongly recommend you go back to those author guidelines.
Thank you. How about when trying to pick a manuscript type, if there are discrepancies in which journal to submit to? So Angela had said, I'm writing a paper that I thought was good for ACS Central Science, however, my co-authors think it's better for JACS. Like, how do you get a good sense for what is most appropriate for where you should submit your work?
So some of this, I think, would be asking peers who've had more experience to see what their recommendations are, and then going back and considering who do you think would be looking into JACS. So who do you want to try and reach? And one thing that I would consider doing is looking at who you're citing. So if you're citing a lot of authors that are publishing in JACS, that is potentially a good indication that you should publish in JACS. Or if it's Central Science, I don't know the age of how old Central Science is. In my journal, that's not possible because we're fairly new, so we don't have that historical citation base yet. You could try emailing the editor-in-chief. I don't know if all editors are, how much they engage in that. And again, sometimes if I have a lot of time, I'll actually help look up potential journals for authors, but I don't always have time to do that. So I do recommend going to ACS's website, and there's a way to sort and search the various journals, because there are many, and try to decide which one is the best one. And if an editor comes back and says, I don't think this is appropriate, sometimes we can transfer journals or submissions to a different journal, but sometimes we can't. So don't take the no from one editor as it's not worth, it shouldn't be published. Take it as an opportunity to do a little more research and see if there's a more appropriate journal for your article.
Awesome. Okay, so I had a question from Venus about what is a good way to start writing articles. I work for a government, but I haven't published in a number of years, but I want to go back to publications.
Oh, yeah. Well, one thing I certainly would do is take a look at, open up a journal and take a look at some of the articles. I think scientific articles, if you go back and look at the anatomy of a manuscript, they are fairly set, formats, traditional, that you can find. I think if I hadn't published in a long time, I might consider trying to find a co-author from somebody who has published more recently, in a field. And, being somebody from the government, you might have a very interesting perspective that would be very attractive for a peer author. So consider that. But otherwise, again, those author guidelines, I think there's a lot more information there. You could also consider doing, so for instance, the reviewer lab. ACS offers a online course you can take to think about how to be a better reviewer. Well, if you understand how to be a better reviewer, you'll also understand how to be a better author. So go back and look at some of those resources that ACS is providing. They've done a nice job, in my opinion, of summarizing critical information, and again, pointing towards other resources that you can look into.
Thank you. Since you mentioned ACS Reviewer Lab, there's a few questions on peer review and reviewers in general. Emily is asking how often are suggested reviewers contacted or used. And there's some questions about, potential bias, just maybe talking through that process and how you do it in your journal.
Well, and I do think every editor probably, has their own flavor of doing this. I think some editors would only, always pick the suggested reviewers. Some would always try to pick, contacts they might know in a field, and others might look at citations or the authors that are being cited. I will tell you, I do a mix of the three. So it's not uncommon for me to pick an author that's been recommended or a reviewer that's been recommended, but I also try to pick someone who's not been recommended. I worried at first when I first started this that all the recommended reviewers would, they might be biased or might not give a critical review. I will tell you, I would say 90% of the time, I feel like they're very unbiased. And in many cases, I can tell when the correct person is reviewing the paper based on the quality of the feedback that they give. Now, I have seen it where there's been a preferred reviewer listed and I happen to know the person and I emailed them. I said, can you review this article? And the person said, no, it's completely out of my field. So that, again, that's the kind of, when I see something like that, that makes me wonder why is somebody picking the names that they are? And what I find is it makes me look at the paper more critically. So I would be careful about who you pick. And you have the option of saying why you're choosing or recommending somebody as a preferred reviewer. Take that opportunity to write that sentence out, because it really does help an editor understand, the value of that person, particularly if you're like me and sometimes check the backgrounds of suggested reviewers. You want them to understand what they're going for. And I will tell you this, it doesn't benefit you to get a review that just says, if it just says minor revisions or offers no suggestions, just says publish. If somebody were to do that as a favor for a friend, it's not. I really think it's a wonderful opportunity and to have peers review your work. And I have every paper that I've seen where the authors embraced and really took on those comments, it is a better paper after the process. And so, try to identify good reviewers. If there's somebody who you've been watching in the literature, put them down as a potential reviewer. You may not agree with everything they say, but all the comments I see coming in really, I think are, for the most part, very thoughtful and engaging. And it feels good to know that somebody really took the time to look at your paper carefully. So when you're recommending those reviewers, take that into account. Don't just put down a friend who you think might do a good job. That's not ethical, but it doesn't serve you either. I will say if I see a lot of reviewers coming from the same institution, I will oftentimes not choose them. It can be difficult to do a review for somebody that it might put you in a strange position. So I recommend looking for people outside of your institution to recommend as reviewers, if possible.
There's a few questions in here about fairness in peer review. For example, if they think the reviewers, there's an unfair review, if a reviewer is asking if they can submit or they should reference the reviewer's papers. So I know maybe you could just talk broadly about your experience so far with those sort of issues.
So I'll give you all some insight for the editor. So I have definitely seen it happen where I had 3 reviewers. One said minor edits, recommended minor edits. One recommended major edits, and one recommended to reject. So we do, sometimes papers are all similar, but sometimes we get a paper that we really have some very polarized or very different opinions from the reviewers. When that happens, I personally find myself engaging the authors more. And that's why when I mentioned that cover letter, when you respond to reviewers' comments, I think is very important. If somebody gives a good argument for why they're not going to respond to a reviewer's comments, I take that into account. If I really feel that the reviews are quite polarized, I know that I personally will reach out and try to find another reviewer or two, because especially if it's outside of my field of expertise, I will look for another opinion. And I have certainly had it where an author emailed me and said, this isn't reasonable, and here's why. And through that process, what ended up happening is the author actually put that into the paper and gave a little bit of background. And I ultimately, allowed the paper to publish with that extra bit of information. So not the change that was recommended, but it was a good justification about why something wasn't being done. So look at these peer reviews as an opportunity to review your own work, to engage potentially with the editor if they are willing to do that. And if not, find other peers to help you look at that from different sides. There are legitimate disagreements in research. And so making that and helping your editor see that in your cover letter will benefit and make your argument stronger if you feel that you should not make a change.
Shifting away from peer review, there's a few questions. There's quite a few questions on just different sections and parts of the manuscript. The first one is about the table of contents, graphical abstracts. So this is the first thing that appears along with the abstract and the title if you look at the table of contents of a paper. So Carmen and Michaela had both asked about this. If you had any advice about how to make them, how much time you should invest in them, just general advice.
Kaylee, you might be better poised to answer that question. And I say that because when I was publishing in graduate school, we published in black and white, and it was, so I'm a consumer of the table of contents graphics now, but you've more recently been involved in those.
Yeah, no, I can take a stab at it. So you want it to be something catchy, that it doesn't have to explain every single detail of what you're doing, and so it doesn't have to be in the form of a figure that's in the text of your manuscript. It can be something intriguing, something that gives an overall, idea of the type of things you'd be talking about, or maybe if there's a key point that you could demonstrate clearly. My suggestion is to look at, even if you don't know what type of journal you're going to submit to yet, just look at examples of ones you might submit to and see what people are doing for ideas. It can be a little difficult to come up with, but I think it really does increase, if people see it and it's catchy, it will increase the views that you have and consequentially the citations your paper has. So it's hard to say how much time you should invest in them, but they can make quite a big impact. Mary Beth, did you have anything to add to that? Things that you find particularly catchy when you see
No, I do think color, is definitely helpful, but you want it to make the point. You don't want to just jazz up an image or make an image. I think that I can tell where they're in your description. Talk about the top line, the middle line, and the bottom line. Whereas a graph, you want a graph to be able to communicate the line no one wants to hear. It needs to be as long as it needs to be. It can be, other aspects of that help give that impression about why somebody might want to read your paper, even if it.
No, that's a good point. The specialization, like if a journal is more specialized, then perhaps there would be less that's needed than something that's multidisciplinary. That's a good. Another thing is if it's the manuscript type, of course, if it's like a letter, that would be very short versus an article versus a review. So again, looking at examples, I think would be a good place to go to.
Absolutely.
How about
understand some of those aspects? That's where peer reviewers become very important. So we work hard to make sure we have the right people reviewing the paper. So if it's in an analytical area that I'm not as familiar with, I spend a lot of time of it, or actually, accept an invitation to
more supporting for key points. I think your comments about making sure your conclusion is really well-rounded. If what are the key points in your conclusion?
Reviewer, it makes an impression. Technical points of the papers.
Survey will pop up directly after the webinar that will only take a minute to complete.